The circus machine didn't just break Alfredo Codona's mind, they destroyed his body first. What really led to the Ringling legend's suicide was a brutal cycle of physical exploitation. Forced to perform his death-defying act through agonizing pain, promoters masked his torn shoulder ligaments with painkillers just to keep revenues high. When his body permanently gave out, he was thrown away. This is the unvarnished truth of how a shattered shoulder drove the greatest aerialist in history to a horrific murder-suicide. The world of the circus, spanning the 1910s to the 1930s, was not merely a place of whimsical cotton candy entertainment. It was a ruthless, industrial-scale meat grinder operating at the absolute peak of its golden era. Inside the massive humid canvas tents of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, human beings were not viewed nor treated as fragile biological entities deserving of care. They were aggressively promoted on colorful billboards as living wonders. But fundamentally, in the ledgers of the circus owners, they were nothing more than biological capital. Circus artists paid the ultimate terrifying price with their own bodies, allowing their living flesh to be transformed into a primary, exploitable tool for earning a living, deliberately eroding their physical forms day after day to manufacture breathtaking beauty, overwhelming shock, and theatrical legends on the stage. During this specific, intensely competitive window of history, the physical boundaries of these performers were pushed to the absolute highest, most terrifying limits conceivable. They were contractually obligated to be aesthetically flawless, mathematically precise, inhumanly flexible, and recklessly courageous, forced by the sheer pressure of survival to repeat these extreme body-destroying movements night after grueling night, simply to feed their careers and maintain their fragile grip on fame. There was a horrifying yet highly profitable inverse relationship at play. You enter the big top. The more radiantly and effortlessly they shined under the spotlight, the more deeply and agonizingly they were paying in the dark with their joints, their torn muscles, their snapping ligaments, their severely compromised nervous systems, and their rapidly vanishing youth. Their bodies were no longer their own private sanctuaries. They had become the foundational bricks, the very mortar and pestle upon which their entire mythical status and financial viability were ruthlessly constructed. The audience demanded a spectacle, and the circus delivered it by extracting the life force directly from the performer's bones. The audiences sitting in the packed, sweltering bleachers paid their hard-earned dimes to witness an illusion of perfect weightlessness, a seemingly supernatural elegance that transported them away from their mundane lives. They saw the glittering rhinestones catching the light, the confident, arrogant smiles, and the effortless, sweeping momentum of bodies slicing gracefully through the thick tent air. But the stark, gruesome reality directly beneath that glamorous surface was a perpetual nightmare of physiological trauma. The contrast between the flawless beauty on stage and the horrific physical reality behind the scenes was absolute and sickening. While the crowd erupted in a frenzy of applause, the artist's cartilage was literally grinding bone on bone, producing a sickening muffled crunch that only they could hear over the brass band. The sparkling velvet ribbons wrapped so elegantly around their wrists were not mere costume decorations. They were desperate, tightly wound tourniquets, hiding swollen wrists, leaking yellow pus, and weeping dark blood from the severe, relentless friction of the hemp ropes. A performer would flash a radiant, victorious grin precisely at the millisecond, their lumbar spine compressed violently, the vertebrae aggressively pinching the deteriorating discs, until microscopic bone spurs stabbed backward into the surrounding inflamed muscle fascia. The audience perceived ethereal beauty and weightless flight, but the hidden truth was a grotesque landscape of overstretched ligaments hanging by a thread, severely spasming muscles rigid with lactic acid, degrading spinal columns, and a constant suffocating chorus of chronic pain that would never, ever fully heal. The tragedy was not an isolated accident, but the fact that the more beautiful they looked on stage, the more agonizing the hidden cost became. This was the era where the agonizing reality of the physical cost was most clearly and brutally intertwined with the blinding glare of the spotlight. It was into this beautiful, brutal slaughterhouse of an industry that Alfredo Codona was born. He was not an outsider recruited into the circus. He was biologically bred for it. His indoctrination into this ruthless economy of flesh did not begin when he was a young man independently seeking his fortune. It began when he was a mere 7.5 months old. Imagine a helpless infant, a fragile, developing bundle of soft bones and delicate cartilage, being balanced precariously on his father's outstretched hand as the charming, crowd-pleasing opening spectacle for the Flying Codona's family act. From the very moment his infant brain began to form its earliest memories, Alfredo was systematically conditioned to understand a chilling foundational truth about his existence. His body did not belong to him. His tiny limbs, his developing sense of balance, his innate reflexes, they were strictly the property of the family business, critical assets to be aggressively leveraged for ticket sales, to keep the audience riveted, and to maintain the family's lucrative contracts. He was entirely denied the fundamental human right of a normal childhood. Instead of play, he was subjected to a rigorous, inescapable, and often cruel physical conditioning program. Every agonizing stretch, every forced tumble, every sharp physical correction from his father was meticulously designed to strip away his human vulnerabilities and forge a living, breathing machine perfectly capable of generating continuous revenue. The deep psychological damage was seeded early and watered daily. He learned quickly that love, familial approval, and even his basic sustenance were entirely conditional upon his physical performance. If he executed the trick perfectly, ignoring the stinging pain in his undeveloped joints, he was fed, praised, and validated. If he faltered, cried, or showed weakness, he was deemed a liability to the act. He was explicitly trained to become a legendary trapeze artist, instructed to live his entire life dictated by the absolute, unforgiving precision of his body suspended precariously high in the air. His identity was fused with his physical utility before he even knew how to speak his own name. As Alfredo matured from a manipulated child into a young adult, the demands placed upon his biological machinery escalated exponentially, pushing him toward the very edge of human endurance. To truly understand the sheer, visceral horror of his daily existence, one must violently strip away the romanticized poetic veneer of the flying trapeze. It is not a graceful sweeping swing. It is a violent ballistic trajectory that treats the human body with extreme prejudice. When an aerialist forcefully leaves the heavy flybar, their body is immediately subjected to intense, ripping G-forces that actively attempt to tear their muscular infrastructure apart at the seams. The shoulder joints, specifically the delicate rotator cuffs, are stretched forcefully and repeatedly far beyond their natural evolutionary anatomical design. The labrum, the vital protective ring of cartilage that keeps the arm bone securely seated within the shallow shoulder socket, is constantly frayed, pinched, and repeatedly micro-torn by the sheer velocity of the swing and the sudden, violently jarring decelerations at the peaks of the EARC. The audience below sees a man majestically flying. The human anatomy above registers a terrifying, sustained physical assault. Every single time, Alfredo launched himself blindly into the gaping void, his internal biological systems, his vascular network, his skeletal framework, his neurological pain pathways, braced for a catastrophic impact. He was an undisputed master of his craft, but mastery in the circus did not mean avoiding physical damage. It simply meant learning how to ruthlessly compartmentalize the agony, actively disassociate from the trauma, and flawlessly hide the gruesome, ongoing physical deterioration from the paying customers. The destruction of his body was not a sudden, shocking accident. It was a slow, highly methodical, and profoundly tragic erosion caused by thousands upon thousands of repetitions, a grueling, uninterrupted travel schedule, and the suffocating, relentless pressure to remain absolutely perfect year after year. The greatest, most heartbreaking tragedy for an artist like Codona was never an instant shock or a single missed catch, but rather the agonizingly slow, calculated, and highly profitable demolition of his physical form. He was dying by millimeters in plain sight, and thousands of people were cheering him on as he did it. The defining hallmark of Alfredo Codona's mechanical perfection, and ultimately the direct catalyst for his complete physical and psychological ruin, was his absolute feverish obsession with conquering the mythical triple somersault. This was the holy grail of the trapeze world, a maneuver so terrifyingly complex, mathematically precise, and physiologically punishing that it was widely considered practically impossible, or at the very least a guaranteed death sentence for anyone foolish enough to attempt it consistently. The mechanics of the trick are a nightmare of physics. It required the flyer to release the heavy bar at the absolute critical apex of their swing, violently tuck their body into a T-tight, highly aerodynamic ball, and spin a dizzying 1,080 degrees through the thin air. 3 complete, blinding, high-speed rotations before blindly untucking and reaching out into the empty space to be caught by the waiting wrists of a swinging catcher. This was not an act of artistic grace. It was a brutal, forceful imposition of raw physics upon a fragile biological organism. The centrifugal force generated during those 3 rapid spins is monstrous, acting like a violent centrifuge on the human body. It forcefully pulls blood away from the brain, creating a massive, ever-present risk of mid-air syncope, causing the performer to black out while hurtling toward the ground. It exerts a tearing, twisting pressure on the fragile vertebrae of the cervical and lumbar spine, threatening to snap the neck with the slightest miscalculation. And the catch itself, the sudden, violent, flesh-on-flesh arrest of all that forward and extreme rotational momentum, acts exactly like a medieval rack. When the catcher's calloused hands lock onto the flyer's wrists, the immense kinetic energy of the spinning body must immediately go somewhere. It rips violently through the arms, aggressively yanking the shoulder joints partially out of their sockets, micro-tearing the biceps, triceps, and pectorals, and sending a concussive, paralyzing shockwave straight down the spinal cord. It is an act of bodily self-destruction masked as entertainment. The physical cost of this single trick was universally known among the elite aerialists. The legendary Ernie Clark had incredibly managed to complete the triple somersault before Alfredo, but he quickly and permanently abandoned it. Clark did not stop out of a sudden lack of courage. He stopped because his body, an intelligent biological system recognizing the imminent, undeniable threat of catastrophic structural failure and permanent paralysis, simply refused to continue. The physical toll, the deep bone bruises, the torn ligaments, and the sheer urological terror were simply too horrifying to sustain night after night. But Alfredo Codona, deeply and fatally infected by the circus's toxic mandate that the show must go on regardless of the human cost, and driven by a manufactured ego that equated his worth with his aerial supremacy, categorically refused to yield. He decided with cold calculation that his biological body must be violently conquered and broken to his will. His journey to mastering the triple somersault was not an inspiring, poetic montage of triumphant practice sessions. It was a gruesome, bloody, and agonizing process of brutal trial and error. To learn the exact split-second timing required to not break his neck, Alfredo had to fall hundreds of times, thousands of times. And falling into a circus safety net from that height is a severe, concussive trauma in itself. The heavy, abrasive rope mesh does not gently cradle a falling body like a featherbed. It arrests it brutally, aggressively throwing the body back up into the air. Landing incorrectly at high velocity causes severe friction, burns that instantly strip the skin down to the raw dermis, severe whiplash that violently tears the delicate muscles and ligaments of the neck, and blunt force trauma that deeply bruises the kidneys, liver, and lungs. Alfredo willingly sacrificed his living, breathing flesh to the unforgiving altar of the triple somersault. He consciously allowed his body to be pulverized, repeatedly microfractured, and torn apart at the cellular level, only to heal improperly with thick, unyielding, painful scar tissue. Through sheer, terrifying, and almost psychotic willpower, he beat his biological form into total submission, forcing his screaming anatomy to become a hardened, unfeeling mechanical instrument capable of executing the impossible. And to the astonishment of the world, he succeeded. He became the undisputed king of the air, the very first human being to perform the triple somersault consistently as a regular features of his act. He built a towering, intimidating aura of invincibility, generating massive, unprecedented wealth for his employers and securing his position as the most famous, heavily marketed aerialist on the entire planet. Yet, in achieving this godlike immortal status, he had quietly and permanently severed his connection to his own humanity. He was no longer a man who happened to perform on the trapeze. He was the trapeze act and nothing else. His entire identity, his soul, his capacity to function as a normal human being was entirely subsumed by his mechanical function in the air. The roaring audience looked up into the rigging and saw a breathtaking miracle of human potential. But inside the glittering, sweat-soaked costume, Alfredo Codona was a rapidly deteriorating, ticking time bomb of necrotic tissue, constantly inflamed joints, frayed, exhausted nerves, and a silent, screaming, inescapable agony. He had successfully transformed himself into the ultimate, highly profitable machine, entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that all machines, no matter how brilliantly engineered, are ultimately destined to break down and destroy their operators. Picture a cold, sterile lawyer's office in Long Beach, California, on a suffocatingly hot afternoon in July 1937. A man, hollow-eyed, intensely trembling, and utterly vacant, barricades the heavy oak door, sealing himself inside. He is a disgraced mechanic, a shattered, impoverished vessel of a human being, about to commit an act of unspeakable, visceral violence. In a sudden explosion of manic despair, he draws a pistol and fires 5 deafening shots into his wife, watching her collapse in a pool of blood before turning the smoking barrel upon his own head, cementing his final, wretched legacy in the police ledgers as a deranged, cold-blooded murderer. Now take that grim, blood-soaked tableau of human failure and place it directly beside another image, a shimmering, impossibly perfect God of the air bathed in the golden, blinding spotlights of Madison Square Garden just a few years prior. This is a deity who effortlessly defies the very laws of gravity, catching the collective breath of tens of thousands of spellbound spectators, receiving the roaring, thunderous adulation of European royalty and the American masses alike, standing triumphant on a pedestal in an immaculate, sequined leotard. The world violently condemns the broken, psychotic killer bleeding out on the linoleum floor, yet that exact same world eagerly financed, demanded, and state-sponsored the agonizing piece-by-piece creation of the hero in the sky. Why is this horrifying paradox happening? The answer lies in a toxic, invisible transaction that continues to dictate our lives today. We live in a relentless society that demands we define our entire existence by our output, praising and validating us only when we function as flawless, highly productive mechanisms. But what happens when a living, breathing, fragile human being is systematically stripped of their soul, hammered into a purely mechanical asset for public consumption, and then inevitably that glorious machine completely breaks down? This macabre normalization of extreme physical suffering was not isolated to Alfredo Codona. It was an industry-wide pathology, perhaps most chillingly and perfectly embodied by the woman who became his second wife, the legendary Ringling Brothers superstar, Lillian Lightsell. To the enraptured public, Lightsell was a celestial vision, a diminutive, breathtakingly beautiful woman who commanded the massive aerial space with a delicate, ethereal grace that seemed entirely divorced from the harsh realities of human anatomy. However, the reality of her signature act was a grotesque exercise in sustained bodily mutilation, demonstrating exactly how a beautiful soft body is used to the absolute bitter end by the circus world. Her grand finale involved a maneuver known as the plunge turn, where she would hang by one wrist from a specialized rope and repeatedly, violently throw her entire body weight over her own shoulder, sometimes completing over 100 continuous rapid-fire revolutions. The anatomical physics of this act are utterly horrifying. With every single violent swing, the immense centrifugal force aggressively ripped the head of her humerus completely out of the shallow glenohumeral joint of her shoulder, audibly dislocating the joint before the momentum violently slammed the bone back into the socket. She was repeatedly, intentionally tearing the vital labrum cartilage, aggressively grinding the protective articular tissue down to raw, exposed bone, and stretching her delicate ligaments until they resembled severely frayed, decaying rubber bands. Yet she performed this horrifying act of self-mutilation with a brilliant, megawatt smile plastered across her face, strictly adhering to her own tragic, fatalistic manifesto. She openly declared that she would infinitely prefer to live one single glorious minute as a high-speed racehorse than endure a long, mundane eternity as a heavily burdened workhorse. Her words were a chilling testament to a mind that had been entirely consumed by the circus machine, a psychology that actively chose rapid, highly publicized biological destruction over the unbearable anonymity of a safe, ordinary existence. The story of her life perfectly highlights the sharp, terrifying contradiction between theatrical beauty and the brutal physical price exacted behind the curtain. The union of Codona and Lightsell was not merely a romantic marriage. It was a terrifying collision of two highly calibrated, self-destructing biological machines, each fiercely enabling the other's terminal addiction to the deafening roar of the crowd. They were the undisputed royalty of the circus world, generating immense, unprecedented wealth for their corporate overlords. Yet they were both fundamentally trapped in a vicious, unbreakable cycle of cycle depletion, where their bodies were strictly viewed as assets for selling tickets and retaining fame. In a functioning biological system, severe trauma must be followed by a prolonged period of rest to allow the intricate network of cells to repair torn muscle fibers and clear out the toxic buildup of lactic acid. But in the ruthless economy of their stardom, rest was considered a fatal weakness, a fast track to being instantly forgotten by a fickle public. When the grueling American summer touring season finally concluded, a time when their battered bodies desperately screamed for immobilization and medical intervention, they categorically refused to stop. Driven by a pathological fear of irrelevance and a bottomless hunger for the spotlight, they would immediately cross the Atlantic to embark on punishing, high-profile winter theater tours across major European capitals. They denied their bodies even a fraction of the time necessary for cellular regeneration, actively choosing to compound their internal injuries, stacking fresh bleeding microtears directly on top of old, rigid scar tissue. They were actively cannibalizing their own physical reserves, burning through their biological capital at a terrifying, unsustainable velocity, just to ensure their names remain perfectly illuminated in bright neon lights above the grand entrances of the world's most prestigious venues. The destruction was not a sudden shock, but a highly profitable, painfully slow demolition. The specific, insidious nature of the triple somersault meant that Alfredo Codona was not merely sustaining superficial injuries. He was subjecting himself to a chronic, unrelenting process of deep centrifugal erosion. This was not a spectacular single moment of failure, but a slow, agonizing, and highly destructive mechanical wearing down of the human chassis. The extreme G-forces generated by accelerating a human body through 3 tight mid-air revolutions actively weaponize the blood within chi. He performer's own veins. The blood is violently forced away from the brain and aggressively packed into the extremities, causing the fragile microscopic capillaries in the eyes, the face, and the hands to repeatedly burst under the immense unnatural pressure. The intricate network of spinal discs, the essential shock-absorbing gel cushions that separate the vertebrae and protect the delicate spinal cord, were being subjected to immense, repetitive, compressive loads far exceeding their biological threshold. With every single brutal catch by the catcher's hands, the kinetic energy violently slammed into Codona's shoulders, sending a catastrophic shock wave directly down his spine, slowly squashing those discs until they bulged, ruptured, and leaked their synovial fluid, allowing the hard, unyielding bones of his spine to grind directly against the sensitive nerve roots. It was a horrifying, invisible necrosis occurring directly beneath the skin. The muscles of his back and shoulders, constantly torn and improperly healed, morphed into thick, rigid bands of restrictive scar tissue, severely limiting his natural range of motion and requiring even more violent, forceful exertion just to achieve the necessary momentum for the trick. the majestic, soaring flight that the audience cheered for, was in reality the visual manifestation of a body actively tearing itself apart at the deepest structural level to create a magical illusion. But the human body, regardless of how ruthlessly it is disciplined, is not an infinite resource. It is a biological ledger that meticulously records every single trauma, every torn fiber, and every crushed cell. And eventually, that terrifying debt must be paid in full. The insidious, creeping erosion of Codona's physical form finally reached a critical, undeniable breaking point in the spring of 1932. It was not a grand theatrical tragedy in front of a massive crowd, but a stark, brutal failure of ruined mechanics. During a routine performance, the microscopic margins of error that kept him alive suddenly evaporated. Whether it was a millimeter of neurological hesitation caused by chronic exhaustion, or a sudden, catastrophic spasm in the dense scar tissue of his back, Codona lost the absolute precision required for the triple somersault. He violently missed the vital connection with the catcher's hands. He plummeted from the suffocating height of the rigging, hitting the heavy abrasive ropes of the safety net with sickening force. The audience gasped, but falls into the net were common enough to be brushed off as part of the thrill. However, internally a major structural collapse had occurred. The extreme twisting impact of the fall aggressively seized the severely compromised muscles of his right shoulder, violently tearing the crucial supraspinatus tendon, the primary anchor that allowed him to lift his arm and bear his own weight. A blinding, white-hot flash of absolute agony ripped through his nervous system as the muscle fibers snapped and recoiled like severed steel cables. The machine had finally cracked, providing the first undeniable evidence that his physical form was beginning to actively betray him. In any logical, humane context, this catastrophic injury would dictate an immediate cessation of all physical activity. A trauma surgeon would mandate strict immobilization, heavy bracing, and months of absolute rest to allow the torn, bleeding tissue a fragile chance to knit itself back together. But Alfredo Codona did not exist within a humane context. He was a highly lucrative property trapped within the ruthless, unforgiving machinery of the circus industry, heavily bound by ironclad contracts that offered absolutely zero concessions for biological failure. The circus owners, the aggressive PR agents, and the massive logistical operation of the tour did not view a torn rotator cuff as a medical emergency. They viewed it as a highly inconvenient disruption to their revenue stream. More terrifyingly, Codona's own deeply warped psychology became his most vicious warden. The sheer, paralyzing terror of losing his prime position, the dread of a younger, healthier flyer usurping his title as the king of the air, and the sickening thought of the audience's adulation fading into deafening silence proved to be infinitely more terrifying to him than the excruciating physical pain of his torn flesh. He was trapped in a horrific psychological paradox. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that his body was rapidly failing him, screaming in biochemical agony to stop. Yet the core essence of the man, heavily manipulated by decades of circus conditioning, violently commanded him to completely ignore the pain and step back out into the light. And so, the true, deeply unsettling horror of his daily existence escalated into an agonizing routine of forced endurance. Every single evening, the preparation for the show became a grotesque, agonizing medical procedure. The trainers would aggressively wrap his ruined, swollen shoulder in yards of heavy restrictive athletic tape, pulling it so inhumanly tight that it actively cut off the blood circulation to his fingertips, creating a rigid, artificial exoskeleton to forcibly stabilize the violently unstable joint. He would ingest massive, dangerous doses of harsh painkillers, intentionally deadening his central nervous system so that he wouldn't instantly pass out from the shock of the pain when he grabbed the heavy fly bar. When he stood on the tiny, precarious pedestal high above the sawdust, he was no longer a man in control of a healthy physique. He was a desperate consciousness violently forcing a broken, dying piece of machinery to execute impossible commands. Every time he swung off the board, the immense G-forces aggressively grabbed the torn, bleeding edges of his shoulder muscle and viciously ripped them further apart. The audience cheered the perceived bravery and skill, utterly blind to the fact that they were actively participating in and financially demanding the real-time, agonizing torture of a human being. This is the absolute peak of emotional devastation for the observer, witnessing the sheer suffocating helplessness of a human being who is fully aware that their body is collapsing, yet is violently denied the right to stop, forced to push through the agony simply because they have no idea how to survive in the world without the circus. He was willingly feeding his own decaying flesh into the grinding gears of the circus machine, trading pieces of his anatomy for a few fleeting seconds of applause. The most tragic aspect of this forced continuation was the terrifying psychological dissociation it required. To survive the blinding pain of performing the triple somersault with a physically destroyed shoulder, Codona had to mentally sever the connection to his own limbs. He began to view his right arm not as a living part of his body, but as a defective, painful, and entirely alien tool that he had to violently subjugate and punish into compliance. This extreme mental detachment forced him to become increasingly reckless. Because his physical strength and fine motor control were rapidly deteriorating due to the massive trauma and the numbing effects of the painkillers, he had to rely on sheer uncontrolled ballistic momentum to complete the rotations. He was no longer flying with precision. He was hurling a broken, heavy object, his own body, through the air with a desperate, aggressive violence, relying entirely on the catcher to absorb the devastating impact. He knew the structural integrity of his shoulder was hanging by a literal thread, completely aware that the heavy, grinding pain echoing in his bones was a dire warning of an imminent catastrophic failure. Yet, the crushing weight of his contracts, the blinding addiction to the spotlight, and the terrifying realization that he had absolutely no other identity outside of this narrow, destructive X's, tense locked him inside a fatal, inescapable loop. He was deeply, profoundly helpless, a prisoner trapped inside a spectacular sequined torture chamber of his own making, forced to march out and smile every night while his body silently screamed for a mercy that the circus would never, ever grant him. The machine was running purely on fractured bone and intoxicating fumes, sprinting frantically towards a brick wall, entirely unable and unwilling to apply the brakes. The devastating bill for decades of relentless state-sponsored physical abuse finally arrived with terrifying finality on the 29th of April, 1933. The setting was Madison Square Garden, the absolute zenith of the entertainment world, packed with thousands of roaring spectators, completely oblivious to the gruesome biological catastrophe about to unfold above them. Alfredo Codona, the undisputed trapeze legend of the 1910s and 1930s, launched himself into the suffocating, humid air of the arena. He was attempting the impossible once again, forcing a physically compromised, severely degraded human form to execute the brutal mathematics of the triple somersault. But the human anatomy, no matter how fiercely disciplined or heavily medicated, possesses an absolute breaking point. At the critical apex of the spin, under the crushing, tearing strain of maximum centrifugal force, the frayed, exhausted cables of Codona's body finally snapped. The catastrophic failure was not merely a missed grip, it was a profound structural implosion. As he violently missed the catcher's heavily taped wrists, the extreme twisting kinetic energy viciously seized his right shoulder. The audience saw a dramatic plummet into the heavy safety net, a routine thrill of the circus, but hidden within the blinding glare of the spotlights was a horrifying anatomical destruction. The crucial supraspinatus tendon, the vital biological anchor that allowed his arm to function, completely avulsed, violently ripping away from the bone with a sickening muffled snap. The head of his humerus was aggressively wrenched from the shallow glenoid cavity, severely shredding the surrounding labrum and the intricate network of stabilizing ligaments into useless bloody debris. This was not a story of general circus danger. This was the horrifying reality of an extraordinary physical body, which had previously created stage miracles, finally being dragged down and utterly destroyed by the very profession that demanded its perfection. When Codona was dragged from the netting, white-faced and convulsing in blinding neuropathic agony, the medical verdict delivered in the cramped, dimly lit backstage medical tent was swift, clinical, and utterly merciless. The severe, irreversible trauma to the complex mechanics of the shoulder joint meant that the king of the air was permanently, irrevocably grounded. The surgeon's words were a death sentence, masquerading as a diagnosis. In that single agonizing moment, the intricate biological machine that had been painstakingly built, marketed, and exploited since he was an infant ceased to be a profitable asset. The chilling efficiency with which the circus machinery immediately discarded him remains one of the most brutal indictments of the entertainment industry. The owners, the promoters, and the vast administrative apparatus of the tour did not offer mourning, rehabilitation, or genuine gratitude for the man who had essentially minted their fortunes with his own blood and cartilage. The very second his physical body could no longer reliably execute the trick and absorb the punishing pain, his immense value plummeted to absolute zero. He was immediately pushed to the cold periphery of the only world he had ever known. The agonizing truth of his existence was laid bare in the sawdust. He was never truly loved or revered as a human being. He was merely a highly calibrated, heavily utilized tool used to achieve fame. And now that the tool was irreparably broken, it was Kerala, as SLE, tossed aside. The psychological torture that immediately followed his physical grounding was infinitely more agonizing than the severe radiating nerve pain constantly burning in his ruined shoulder. Stripped of the air, Codona was subjected to the ultimate humiliating degradation of becoming an equestrian director, a glorified earthbound stage manager forced to stand helplessly in the dirt while the show aggressively moved on without him. The visual contrast was a masterclass in psychological cruelty. Instead of wearing the glittering, triumphant sequins of the Starflyer, he wore the mundane, heavy wool of a director's coat, forced to tilt his head upward and watch the airspace he once completely dominated. He had to stand there physically aching and emotionally hollowed out and watch in silent, suffocating agony as his own young, hungry protege, Clayton Behe, climbed the precarious rope ladder to the pedestal. Codona watched the young man aggressively throw his healthy, uncompromised body into the void, executing the exact same triple somersault and violently stealing the deafening, addictive roar of the crowd that Codona fundamentally believed belonged solely to him. Every thunderous round of applause directed at the younger man felt like a physical knife twisting into Codona's chest. This was the horrific climax of a life where personal identity was dangerously fused with a physical act. Without the ability to fly, without the constant, intoxicating validation of thousands of screaming voices, Codona realized with terrifying clarity that he did not know who he was. His ego, entirely constructed upon the foundation of physical supremacy and the ability to withstand extreme bodily punishment, violently shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. Unable to endure the daily visceral humiliation of watching his own legacy be eagerly consumed by another, the broken machine desperately tried to escape the circus entirely, initiating a rapid, tragic spiral downward into complete obscurity. The legendary artist who had once casually dined with European monarchs and dictated the terms of massive international theatrical contracts found himself bitterly exiled to the greasy, oil-stained concrete floor of a small automobile garage in Long Beach, California. He became a common mechanic, a silent, brooding man attempting to fix broken metal engines with a severely crippled right arm that throbbed incessantly with deep, unhealed bone pain. The stark, horrifying dichotomy of his existence was unbearable. He traded the ethereal, weightless magic of the high trapeze for the heavy, suffocating stench of gasoline and rusted iron. His hands, which had once caught the calloused wrists of his brother in midair with millimeter precision, were now permanently stained black with engine grease. When the local newspapers bothered to mention him at all, they stripped him of his majesty, callously demoting him to a mere former trapeze star. The public, who had once eagerly paid to watch him risk his life, completely forgot his existence the moment he could no longer provide them with their adrenaline fix. The sheer, crushing weight of this absolute loss of identity acted like a potent, fast-acting venom on his already fragile psyche. He was a spectacular, high-performance engine, violently forced into a terrifyingly mundane, agonizingly quiet life, and the sudden lack of extreme centrifugal pressure caused his mind to completely implode. The chronic, untreated physical pain that radiated constantly from his ruined shoulder joints severely compounded his deep psychological rot. Without the intense, blinding adrenaline of the nightly performance to aggressively mask the physical trauma, Codona was left alone in the quiet dark with the horrifying reality of what he had allowed the circus to do to his body. Every single movement was a sharp, agonizing reminder of the industry that had ruthlessly chewed him up and spat him out. This toxic, festering concoction of severe physical degradation, complete loss of professional identity, and the lingering, unresolved grief over the tragic, violent death of his former wife, Lillian Lietzel, pushed his final marriage to Vera Bruce directly over the edge of the abyss. Bruce, herself a former aerialist, represented the absolute last, fraying tether that connected his deteriorating mind to the reality of the circus world. When the suffocating, paranoid toxicity of their relationship finally reached its inevitable conclusion and she formally filed for divorce, that final desperate safety line aggressively snapped. Codona was left entirely untethered, drifting in a terrifying, bottomless void of complete irrelevance. He was a man who had been explicitly trained since infancy to believe that his only worth was derived from his physical utility to others, with his body broken and his final audience of one abandoning him, his brain violently malfunctioned. The history of Alfredo Codona serves as a factual record of the physical and psychological toll inherent in early 20th century extreme performances. His biography highlights the harsh reality faced by athletes whose livelihoods and identities were entirely tied to their physical capabilities. When permanent injuries dismantled those capabilities, these performers frequently received no structural or psychological support to navigate their forced retirement from the industry. Codona's historical legacy remains distinctly divided. He is documented as the first aerialist to consistently perform the triple somersault, a significant milestone in circus history. However, this achievement is permanently linked to the criminal manner in which his life concluded. While he successfully avoided fatal accidents in the air, despite the constant risks associated with his profession, the sudden loss of his career created an insurmountable challenge. His record stands as a clear historical example of the intense pressures placed on performing artists and the severe consequences of physical decline in that era.